All right, for our presentation today, we have Mr. Frishman back. Since he talked, I think last year about this art and horology, it was very interesting to me. My daughter's an art major, she loves art history, so it kind of piqued my attention in that. So he's wonderful his presentation, so we really appreciate you spending so much time with our chapter. It's been really great having you here. But with that, I'll give it over to him.
Okay, I did my share screen, so I hope you all are seeing the first image here of this Asian woman holding a clock. Is that what we're seeing? Thumbs up?
Yeah. Yes.
All right, that's great. All right, well, thanks for having me back. It seems like eventually I'm going to have to become a chapter or move to a chapter member or move to Atlanta or start paying dues or something. But anyway, I'm again happy to be here. Okay, well, I'm happy to be here again. I always felt like I could be anywhere on the space station or Mars or something talking to you. So I thought it'd be good for you to just understand where I am now. And I know where you are, but just so you get a sense, you see up there on the top left, Andover is my town, about 20 miles north of Boston, and you see the Atlantic Ocean is out there, and Cape Ann and Rockport and all those nice places too. So I'm happy to live in New England and again, giving you a sense of where I am. My town of Andover was an early one. As you can see, it was founded in 1646, not long after the folks arrived on the Mayflower. You see them here about 20 years earlier, drawing up the Mayflower Compact as they were sitting in their boat in Provincetown Harbor before they made it to Plymouth. So it's an early town, and we've got some history here as well. This is my home in the Shawsheen village of Andover, which has some historic importance that maybe I can tell you about another time. And you see the name of my business is on the front door, kind of. It says Bell Time, but since it wasn't my home, I didn't have any neon flashing or anything. But it's a nice home that celebrated its 100th birthday a few years ago too. It was built in 1919, so we're happy to be there. And I didn't do a selfie, but this is the chair I'm sitting in as I'm speaking to you. And you see my computer set up there, and I've got some art on the wall. This used to be my clock repair shop with pegboard all around and watchmaker's bench and everything. But that all got moved to the cellar when I decided that I didn't want to be fixing clocks 24/7 anymore. I had lecturing and writing to do. So this is the place where I'm sitting right now talking to you. So I hope that kind of gives you a little context of where I am and where I spend a lot of my hours very, very happily these days. And my town, there wasn't a lot of clockmaking that happened here. But as you see, Nathan Adams made the clock that's standing at our local historical society back in 1792. He went on to move to other places, but he was here a few years, and we had one other clockmaker, early clockmaker in town too. So some of that went on right within a mile of where I'm sitting. So when I do my horology and art talk, it's always kind of a challenge because, as you see, my latest tally of images related to this on my computer is 2,871. So I'll try to make it 2,700 today. So I hope you brought your sleeping bags and your Tupperware so you can sit here. But just kidding, don't be scared. It's actually many fewer than that, but I hope you do enjoy this presentation again on horology and art. And I should remind you, because sometimes people are confused, especially at auction houses. I said, oh, I like the paintings with clocks in them. They think I mean these German tourist ones where there's actually a working clock in the painting. And that's not what I'm talking about, even though I appreciate these. I don't own one. I've seen them, and mostly the art is bad, so I haven't been that tempted to have one. But they are kind of interesting to have these working clocks, and often music boxes and other things are inside these paintings too. And you probably remember a few of the images that I presented last time when I talked about Japanese horology, because of course there are these beautiful Japanese woodblock prints that have images of the Japanese timekeepers that I told you about last time. So I've been At this probably 20 some years, one of the first ones I discovered was this image of Napoleon. He's hard at work in his Tuileries studio. It's, as you can see, it's about 4:12 a.m. The candle's about burned down. And this was done by the famous, one of the most famous French artists or artists in the world, David. And this actually was commissioned by a Scottish nobleman because the Scots weren't always that happy about being associated with England at that time. And some of them actually hoped Napoleon would win some of those wars. So the Scottish nobleman had this hanging in his house. It's now hanging in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., where you can see this big, beautiful painting. And you can see it's probably a Janvier regulator in the back with a nice gridiron pendulum that would keep that clock accurate for Napoleon as he was working on his running of France at that time. And you probably are familiar with this series. I did 36 in total in the bulletin back some years ago, where I would focus on a painting, the artist, the context, and a list of these is on my website. I'll show you that as we get closer to the end. But several of the paintings I'm going to discuss, I actually have researched and written about in my series of articles. And I know folks always start getting nervous about whether I have remembered that Salvador Dali painted some interesting horological imagery. And I want to assure you right away that I haven't forgotten about it. This is his most famous one, I guess, and with these drooping, melting clocks. And the story was that he was painting the environs where he lived in Spain, and you see the background there, the seafront. And then he went and had dinner, but he was suffering from a bad migraine, and he had some very runny cheese. And he went back into his studio, and I guess that runny cheese inspired him to think about the concept of time being kind of malleable and also kind of drooping like this. So there's an interesting backstory. And when I saw this painting originally, I only saw it in reproductions, and I imagined it was this nice big painting where you'd stand back and really soak it in. But as you see, it's quite small. It's about the size of a cereal box. But it's one of the most famous paintings that people come and see at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. As you can see, they're flocking around this, perhaps like they do at the Mona Lisa in the Louvre. But it's very popular, but also it was surprising to me how small it was when I first saw the painting in the flesh. And you were reminded about a symposium I did at the Henry Ford Museum that I'll mention, but I did one the year before at the Museum of Fine Arts about horology and art. This is our Boston museum where I did this symposium. This was one of the posters I produced for it back in 2017, where I had an international roster of speakers that spoke about horology and art and all of its permutations. It was a fascinating event, and I think most of those lectures can be viewed online through the NAWCC website. So in fact, one of my first speakers was Larry Berman, who is a curator of ancient Egypt art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And he gave a fascinating talk as he reminded us that the interior of these mummy cases often had these star charts, which were not only designed to guide the dead person on their journey to the afterlife after they had died by viewing these scenes inside their mummy case and coffin case, but they actually had specific times of day. They weren't just calendars or directions. They, according to the Egyptian timekeeping system of watching the stars appearing over the horizon and where the moon was and all that, these were specific instructions about certain times where the dead person was supposed to have reached certain milestones in their traveling to the afterlife. So horology and art goes back many, many millennia, not just centuries. As we'll talk about soon. The other thing he spoke about was water clocks, which of course the Egyptians had as well. And one fascinating aspect of this is that often the water clocks, the outlet was represented by a carved baboon. And that's where the water stream came out. And according to this curator, the baboon was the symbolic animal on these water clocks because supposedly, I don't know if this is true, I haven't been to the zoo to count it, but supposedly baboons urinate on a very regular basis, maybe once an hour or so. So I guess, the Egyptians thought this was the appropriate animal to have on a water clock. So there's a bit of trivia. I hope somebody will confirm or deny that, who knows more about baboons than I do. But we have also, this is 4th century, a Greek mosaic that shows a sand glass, an hourglass sitting on top of a pillar, which I suppose they did back then. And the translation of this writing is "I'm late for lunch," because they already in the 4th century were being bothered, consumed by the fact that time tellers like hourglasses and sand glasses and sundials were already kind of ruling people's lives. They couldn't eat when they were hungry. They had to wait for the shadow to hit the 12. They couldn't go to bed until, the sundial showed that it was time. So already people were perhaps suffering from the tyranny of timekeeping that we're so familiar with today as well. In the past years, I've subdivided my talks into these various subjects because there's so much about each of these periods that I can talk about. And so I'm just giving you a very quick overview of some of these subject areas that I've talked about, because again, this subject goes back really to about the beginning of the invention of mechanical timekeeping in the 1300s. And they started to be, clocks and watches started to be represented in art very early on, as you see here. So this is one of the earliest, where they clearly had religious connotations back then. There was this notion of God, the clockmaker. There was the analogy, the metaphor that he had created the universe, the world, and kind of like a clockmaker does, and then he set it in motion the same way that once the clockmaker has done his work, he swings that pendulum or starts the folio swinging, and it comes to life the same way that the world and the universe did when God created it. So this was a very common feeling at that time, and a lot of the artwork represented that. But fortunately for us too, there were very early depictions of clockmakers at work, clock shops at work. People were interested in what went on there and what they did and what they looked like. So this is a very early depiction of a clockmaker shop. You see a great sort of double stacked early drum clock there that clearly has a fusee in it and some bells. And these guys are working and filing and adjusting. So if we ever invent time machines to go back and visit, I imagine a lot of us would want to visit these shops and see these guys at work 400 or 500 years ago. The famous Italian artist Titian did several images with clocks in them, because at this time clocks were quite expensive, even little ones like you see here, and they really could only be owned by the richest people, the nobility, the royalty of their times. This is the Duchess of Urbino, who is a portrait subject of Titian, and you see that there's not a lot in this painting, so clearly the clock is important. We see her lands through the window she took over when her husband was exiled for getting into political trouble. Her little watchful spaniel is there as well, and there's the little clock. So, and anybody looking at this painting then would immediately get the idea, not only is she wealthy and can afford a little clock probably made in southern Germany or northern Italy, but she's disciplined. She respects modern things, the advances in technology, and she has a little ticking machine there in addition to her rich clothing and other things that indicate her status in life. And here's an example of the kind of clock she would have had then. Of course, these are, again, these early Nuremberg, Augsburg clocks, single-handed, of course, back then too, but often with an alarm and striking. You see the bell there on the top under the fretwork. And clocks were very quickly not only metaphors for God, the clockmaker, but also of human mortality and how time is going by. We only have one life here. We need to take full advantage of it. We need to be moral and ethical and good people, because in the afterlife we'll be either praised or punished for what we do in this life. So this is entitled the Knight's Dream, because he's clearly dreaming. The angel there is holding up the message about how, they need to live their lives. And there's all this symbolism there of the skull and the globe and the mask, the death mask, the guns, the money, all the things that can lead us astray or lead us in the right direction for living a good life now. So he's dreaming this. And of course, dead center, almost dead center, is one of these little miniature Augsburg tower clocks. And there's a very similar example. Now, of course, these are very rare and occasionally come up at auction, but mostly are in museums. But they were very complicated too. They had often astrological symbolism, as well as alarms and striking. So they really were masterpieces created by the clockmakers of the time. And the Dutch also produced these paintings showing, again, the glass that's tipped over, that's spilled, the violin music as earthly pleasures that you need to enjoy, but don't forget the skull is there too, to reminding you where we're all heading after this life. And again, very often are images of these early watches. And because these Dutch artists were painting with such care, and often a brush with one hair even to get the detail, you can see great detail in the watches laying on these tables. I see a watch key there, a nice ribbon, and you can even kind of see the barrel and the fusee chain there. We know that this is a striking watch because there's a bell in the open cover. So this was a sophisticated timepiece. But one of the great things about this too is that if you look in the glass ball, you see the artist reflected. You see he's gotten himself in the painting, painting this scene. So it's a great image of that too. And all of these artists, I could tell you the dates and names, but you probably wouldn't remember them. But any of these that interest you, please feel free to contact me and I can give you the details on these paintings as well. Of course, I looked long and hard for a Rembrandt painting. I certainly wanted to include him as one of the most famous Renaissance painters. So here you see a young woman and she has a watch dangling. That was a typical scene. You'll see some more of those because, again, a watch was a symbol of sophistication, and it showed that she was rich and sophisticated and appreciated modern technology. So, but my favorite Rembrandt painting is this grisaille. This is a grisaille is an original sketch that was going to be used for an engraving. So this is, of course, Christ before Pontius Pilate. And you see, an anachronistic image of a clock there, which is similar to one that was in Venice. But of course, there were no mechanical clocks back in Christ's time. So when Rembrandt got around to creating the etched plate that he was going to make his prints from, you see that the clock is now gone. So maybe somebody at some point said, Rem, they didn't have clocks back then. And he took it out of the final print. So this is the print that you'll see often, but the original artwork had a clock in it. So the Dutch also like to portray some of their colleagues who maybe weren't as severe and religious and observant as a lot of the Dutch merchants were. So Jan Steen created these genre scenes of unruly Dutch households, often with the people in black who are trying to read the Bible and feel like this family needs to be reformed. But this is just chaotic there. You see the pig there, but up in the top right there, you see a monkey playing with the Dutch clock, playing with the chains. And monkey, everything here, again, people would understand the symbolism of. Monkeys were symbols of kind of lascivious behavior or lust. And there's the monkey playing with the clock up there while everybody else is carousing in various ways. There's a close-up of this monkey playing with, again, a single-handed Dutch clock of that period that often would hang very high up in the wall, so that the weights had enough room to fall over a day's period. Here's another Dutch painting, again with the clock up here. And this is a matrimony discussion. You see the bride-to-be is peeking through the door at the right, while the two elders, I suppose the parents and perhaps the mother there, are grilling the proposed suitor in the center. But this is a good way for them to, again, show that this is an affluent family with one of those early Dutch clocks on the wall. And there's another example just in real life. These, again, mostly are museums. They're early, interesting clocks. But just so you see, again, a better image of that type of clock. William Hogarth painted in England, painted a lot of interesting scenes with clocks in them, often with moral instruction. This one is not telling them. This is the family of a family named Graham. So you see up on the left there is one of those ebonized English bracket clocks of the 18th century, even with he's telling the story here again of the passage of time. So he's showing Father Time with his scythe up top there. But another reason I love this is the young boy on the right, below the cat that would like to get at that bird in the cage. He's got an instrument called a seranet. And that was kind of like a roller organ that you would crank, and it would create melodies that they hoped that the bird would learn to sing. So that's a sort of a double benefit of this painting, because here's a seranet, and I was lucky to find one in the museum at Colonial Williamsburg. So you can see this would crank. It has kind of a roller organ system inside, and those are the tunes up top there that they would, not only that they could sing along with or entertain themselves, but again, try to get a bird to sing the same melody. So some of you may remember the Horology 1776 symposium I put on in Philadelphia in 2021. Something I used, an illustration I used for this was this Paul Revere engraving. You see his name down there at the bottom right. This was a propaganda piece. It didn't really happen like this. John Adams was the lawyer for the defense, defending the British soldiers who were certainly provoked and attacked before they opened fire and killed some of the people there. But this is great because this is a scene in colonial Boston, and you see the State House, the old State House there, and the old brick church in the back. So this again is a twofer, where the diamond dial on the old brick church has a public mechanical clock, but on the State House direct center in front of us is a wall-mounted sundial. And here you see a close-up of that image. Certainly, there's a lot of public buildings, a lot of church buildings in Europe and America that had these vertical sundials on the face facing south, so that even if the clock stopped working and it was a sunny day, you could see the time from the cast of the shadow. So another subcategory that I speak about a lot is American folk art. And some of that, as I'll mention too, was posthumous. They were images because of watches, again, symbolizing human mortality. A watch was often used in images of people who had passed away, particularly children. So we know this is a posthumous scene of a young person, young boy who had died. And here he's listening to the watch tick away his final moments, perhaps. We're lucky sometimes too that some of these folk art paintings actually show horologists, watchmakers at work. So here you see this guy is proudly displaying a few of his tools. Even you see down there in the lower left, as well as the watch that he's been working on as well. I mean, you could claim that clock dials are a form of folk art too. You know, these were painted by amateurs more. These weren't fine artists, but you could say that the painting on clock dials, and probably Lee Davis with his horological art chapter would agree with me that there is folk art on clocks. But I'm talking about art with folk art with clocks and watches in it. This is one of my favorites, early 1800s by Robert Peckham. This is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and this looks like a party, but it's actually not. It's a somber setting because the little girl down here, little Elizabeth, had died a few months before Robert Peckham painted this family group. So even though it's probably summer, you see it's a somber setting, the shades are down. And this was a way that they wanted to say that we still remember little Elizabeth, remember the people who have died. They're still within our family group, even if they no longer are here physically. And this was actually a posthumous painting of George Slacks, who died at 11/22 on May 8th, 1829. So this is commemorating the very moment of his death. This is a great little watercolor folk art painting that's also in the Colonial Williamsburg collection. Joseph Davis, the left-handed painter, they called him until they were able to identify him. He was an itinerant painter. He would go from house to house, town to town and paint portraits, these simple silhouette portraits, and often include a clock in it. Whether this family had a clock or not, we don't know. But they probably could ask if they could have a clock within the scene to show again that they were somewhat sophisticated. So you see the actual names of the family being depicted here, and they had books. You see the Bible and the children, fancy painted floor covering, but also one of these stenciled column clocks. And of course, these are common. We see these. We still see these for sale a lot, but I like this one because that's actually got kind of a folk art tablet, glass tablet as well. I doubt it was the original. It might have been. But you see, it's a nice, great example of folk art that happens to be in a clock again. Again, the type that I think Lee Davis would be very happy to see. I've started to collect when I can some of these folk art paintings. This is one I was fortunate to buy a year or two ago. And you see that this is a mother and child. Again, this might be posthumous. She's wearing black. That child may have died, and this was commemorating it. But you see that they're both holding a pocket watch. She's got a grip on it, even though the young boy is gripping the watch ribbon as well. So this is, I think, fairly well executed. I don't mind seeing this woman and child following me around the room when I'm looking at it. So Robert Peckham also created this family group. Either the children were much larger back then, or he had a little issue with perspective and how big people's heads were supposed to be, because certainly this kid's head is as big as his parents, even the rest of the body, and the watch even looks rather oversized too. But it's a great example again of American folk art. Here we see again another mother in black, perhaps again another deceased child holding the watch as the symbol of mortality. A nice fancy painted chair there that we see as well. Again, these are all 1830s folk art. We know from the style of the clothing and all too. This is a little miniature painting that's owned by my own town's historical society. Again, the mother in black, we're not sure, with the child there holding the watch. We have a group scene of children there too. That little tyke there, I'm sure would like to grab that watch and perhaps let it drop, but it's being secured by the other child's ribbon around their hand. So, and again, we have this image of people listening to the clock ticking. I guess, clocks were, watches were still novels. Not everybody could own one back then. They were expensive. So if you had one, of course, you were intrigued by the ticking sound. So it would be an interesting subject for the artist to portray of people, young people, older people holding that watch up to their ear. Another great image of a watch ribbon. These were often embroidered, braided, woven by women to give along with the watch to somebody. The chains weren't always used. These ribbons were what was used instead to hold these watches. So here we have a great image of a banjo clock up on the left. You see it's on a bracket. I always kind of like when I see banjo clocks not just hanging on a nail on the wall, but either sitting on a mantle maybe or being held up on a wall bracket in a little different scenario. This little girl seems a little unhappy about having to sit there, having her portrait painted, but the cats on the window seat don't seem to mind at all while this banjo clock is ticking away the time. Again, this is one of my favorites. The artist, again, I think had a perspective issue here where either the kids were much bigger back then or the steeple clocks were smaller. But again, it's a fun folk art painting that works some strawberries in there and all too. This is also at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This is a miniature painting. Again, I was able to purchase this one. Very rarely have I seen these miniature portraits. This is actually watercolor on ivory, painted in the 1840s, probably painted locally in Lowell, Massachusetts, near me. And you see the watch with one of those long slide chains is poking out of her pocket there. Oddly enough, women back then had no shoulders, as we seem to be seeing in these paintings. But I guess, it was just a way to make women look more appealing somehow. But I'm always intrigued by the absence of shoulders. This woman has some shoulders, but not even as many as perhaps was anatomically correct. But you see that her nice watch is sticking out of the front pocket of her dress as well. This woman's a little more formidable. She does have shoulders, as well as a very interesting headpiece as well. And that's an incredible kind of braided chain or cord that she's got that watch on, to make sure that that watch doesn't slip and fall anywhere soon. This is another one of the paintings I was able to buy. This woman is looking at me from the wall right now. Again, one of these interesting lacy headpieces and all, but clearly she's proud of that watch and chain, and she wanted to make sure that it was included in her portrait. Fractors too, these German folk art things that often were full of all kinds of German language, biblical sayings and aphorisms, but often they have clocks in them because they're also, again, beating on that theme of human mortality. And we think, boy, this clock looks over fancy. Perhaps none of them were decorated to that extent. But as we know, there are these German, Pennsylvania Dutch area clocks that were vividly painted, sort of like the one we saw in that Fracture. And of course, Edward Lansome Henry illustrated the Longfellow poem, The Clock on the Stairs. He showed the painting to a Longfellow who said, yeah, that's you captured it. That's the way it looks. And I'm sure a lot of you remember this poem, where the ancient timepiece that stands there, continues as it's ticking, to at least as Longfellow felt it was saying, forever, never, never, forever, again, dealing with this issue of the passage of time and human mortality. I have this great quote by Longfellow that's relevant, art is long, but time is fleeting. So here we see the poet as he was depicted. So we're getting a little bit more contemporary. This is Cezanne, where he painted a clock that actually belonged to his friend Émile Zola, the writer. But we've seen this a number of times where the clocks in these kinds of paintings don't have hands, because I think the artist, again, is making the point that, it doesn't really matter what time it is. The time is a symbol of time's passage and human mortality. He doesn't want us to get hung up on what time the clock is showing. He wants it to really maintain its symbolism of what he's trying to portray here. But here we see Magritte has this famous painting that's at the museum in Chicago. This is a big painting. When I saw this, it was almost overwhelming in its size. And we see one of those typical French marble clocks on the mantle there. I don't have a train coming out of my fireplace, but I guess this is something that he was able to picture. And Vincent van Gogh, clearly, a troubled artist too. This is a scene from the cafe that he was in late at night sipping his absinthe. And we see one of those sort of typical Morbier French bakery clocks up there on the wall behind him, also in kind of a distorted form, as well, as Vincent must have been seeing things at that late hour in his French cafe. This gets a little humorous, but another late hour. You see, this was actually created as an advertisement for a cigar company. So there's a series of these, and a lot of these have the clock in the back here. You see it's 10 past 1 at night, and these dogs are sitting there playing poker. And you see the cigar smoking dog in the right foreground here is trying to help out his partner by passing him an ace. And the title of this painting was A Friend in Need. But again, this was part of an advertising campaign for cigars of the time. A lot of people painted the Tower of Big Ben, the Westminster Tower in London. This is Childe Hassam, and these are Impressionist paintings now. Winslow Homer caught the tower there too back in the 1800s. And also Monet spent some time in England as well and captured the tower as well. And this is a photograph, and I'll show you some more artistic photographs later. But this photograph was taken the first day in 1859 when the clock struck for the first time. So they commemorated that event, showing that tower there. And of course, that tower is still there, which the whole movement was recently renovated by my friend that lives in the UK, a 6-year restoration project. We heard him speak last year at our Lancaster National Convention about his restoration of the movement there. Again, a great guy, and I hope to visit him again soon in the UK. And I'll mention a few other posters too as horology and art. But here's one from the 1948 London Olympics, the first Olympics held after World War II. And you see, they're showing that iconography of the tower there as well. Edward Hopper, certainly an artist, famous artist we know of. This is him, a picture of him, and he's got a little clock there on his mantle. But one of his art pieces that I focused on and did one of my feature articles about was this called 7 a.m. It's probably Truro, Massachusetts. He summered for 30 years on Cape Cod, the Outer Cape. And like typical of Hopper paintings, it's kind of ominous. We're not sure what's going on here. We know what time it is because of the school clock in the window, but we're not even sure what this clock sells, and the woods are kind of dark and scary looking. Originally in a sketch, we knew a woman was looking out of the window upstairs. He decided not to put her in the final painting. So, but there's, this wonderful aura of these paintings. And clearly, that clock couldn't be more dead center. It was important for Hopper to include it in the painting, and it's telling part of the story. Matisse, his Red Studio, again, that clock dead center. This is an impressionistic view of his studio in France, showing kind of one of these typical French floor standing clocks, along with the other things that was in his studio at the time. This, again, is a big painting. You see it here. It was featured in a New York City exhibit just a couple of years ago that I attended. And again, this gives you a sense of it. And if you want to know what the artist looked like in this case, this is Matisse sitting outside of that studio, that same studio. If you went in that door, you'd get to see the clock standing there in the room inside. So Marc Chagall, when he emigrated from Eastern Europe, he certainly remembered this German wall clock that was in his home in Eastern Europe, and it's included in a number of his paintings. There he is with his wife, Bella, that he's painting. And at one point, he even painted Bella as kind of swinging along with the pendulum of that same German wall clock. So, he's saying something here again about the passage of time and how we're all kind of controlled by these swinging pendulums and ticking clocks in our lives. Edvard Munch, very famous painting. There was another New York City exhibit titled Between the Clock and the Bed, which is the title of this painting. This is within a year of when he passed away. He's in old age. He's trying to decide whether does he just keep working or does he decide that, he's done enough and he can lie down now. The clock is still there ticking, but no hands on the clock again. But he's undecided, standing there, and you see even at his feet is kind of a crucifix form in the reflection of the floor, open door behind him to the right, where he's considering his life's choices as he only has a short period left to live. So Norman Rockwell, you see him here doing a self-portrait for himself, but he has some great illustrations. Sometimes people dismiss him as just an illustrator, but clearly he was a fine artist who could do wonderful work. This perhaps is one of his most famous. Clearly he did many covers for the Saturday Evening Post and other magazines, but I think this may be one of his most famous ones. Again, this is a twofer. You see the guy is consulting his watch as he's setting the hands on this building clock. This is another Norman Rockwell where this could be any one of us guys, I guess, when we were little boys watching, or maybe it's one of us old guys now sitting working on watches while the little boy looks on with fascination and maybe planning to become a watchmaker himself someday. So Andrew Wyeth, one of his paintings actually was in a series of postage stamps, American postage stamps. I have a nice big print of this. The original's in a private collection, but Well, we now know we're at 11 o'clock here, but I'll keep talking anyway. There's a great pillar and scroll in the room, Andrew Wyeth. And of course, he's most famously known for this painting, Christina's World, that he painted up there in Maine. His son, Jamie Wyeth, painted this compelling image of a tall clock. I met Jamie Wyeth. He told me that this clock is still in the family, still in a family home up there in Maine. This young man was called Orca Bates. He was kind of a wild child that lived on Monhegan Island, where Jamie Wyeth also lived for a time and did these paintings. And he often included this young man, Orca Bates, in his paintings. I guess he was just intrigued by the look of this kid that mostly was scampering around the island, but in this case was dressed up to be in this painting. We can't quite see the maker of this clock, but it could be one of those Maine coastal 18th century clocks that we're familiar with. There's Jamie Wyeth up there in Maine. He's quite a character and of course quite a wonderful artist as well. Of course, I looked for Picasso, hoping I would find one. This was about the best I could do, but that watch on this woman is almost front and center. So I do have a Picasso. We have a Roy Lichtenstein, this pop art kind of thing too, where clearly this alarm clock is front and center in the artwork. And Jasper Johns too has this great image of a watch on a more contemporary art background too. And Philip Guston, just a very big exhibit of Philip Guston's work, both at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and then it moved to the Tate Museum in London. And there's countless Philip Guston paintings that have clocks and watches in them extremely boldly, and they're almost never mentioned. And I get frustrated with this. I went to the press preview at the Museum of Fine Arts. I said to the museum curator there, hey, how come you never talk about the clocks? Well, he just kind of brushed me off. He said, oh, I guess you know what kind of clock that is, Bob. And, that was his only thing, even though clearly Philip Guston, was trying to say something with these. And I got so frustrated that I actually responded to a review of the Philip Guston exhibit at the Tate Museum in London. This was in the London Review of Books. And I'm just complaining because there must have been a 5-page, 10,000 word review of Philip Guston's artwork. And he mentioned clocks just 3 times, just in passing. The illustration he used for the whole exhibit had that clock dead center, never mentioned it. So I got a little irritated about it. And apparently my irritation was significant enough for them to publish this article in an issue, a next issue of the London Review of Books. So, maybe if I hammer away at this subject long enough, more art critics, art reviewers will start to pay attention to the clocks and watches in these paintings, because pretty universally they don't. And it's always puzzled me, but it kind of motivates me too to continue to do my lectures, my study about this, and my writing about this, not just for groups like you, but for art people and the public to start paying attention to clocks and watches. So I also deal with, of course, with early photography and the great images of clocks and watches in it. One of the first inventors of photography, Henry Fox Talbot, along with Daguerre. Talbot was the one that created negatives so that you could reproduce these images. And of course, these early photographs had long exposure times that you needed the time. You needed timepieces, so they were part of it. So this is one of the first pictures of photography being done. And you see Henry Fox Talbot is there with a timer because he timed these exposures. You did it wrong. It was either too dark or too light, and the photograph was useless. So timing it was extremely important. So here's another, we see a daguerreotype here, and artist. He's taking a portrait, and you see that he's holding that watch. He has timed this. In his right hand, he's holding the lens cover because there was no shutter. You would remove the lens cover, look at your watch, And after 30 seconds, 30, longer, there were often head clamps that would hold your head so you didn't move and blur the image. And then when the exposure time was done, he'd put the lens cap back on and then start doing it. So I've started to collect daguerreotypes, if I could, that show clocks and watches in them. Here we see a clockmaker with his wife, his tools, and it's actually a wooden movement clock there on the left that you see. You can see those wood barrels with him at work. And once again, a guy holding a watch up, hearing it ticking, another daguerreotype. We see this young boy in an early photograph showing that he's got a watch too that he can show. And there were a lot of Mathew Brady portraits. I did a whole article about this that you can read in a past bulletin because a lot of subjects of Mathew Brady's Civil War era photographs had this clock in this that was in his studio. This is George Custer, who returned several times for his portrait to be taken by Mathew Brady. We see this clock portrayed in them. There's a lot of stereo views. I've tried to collect a lot of stereo views that have clocks and watches in them. This is the observatory at the top of Mount Washington, one of the windiest places in the world. These guys were stuck up there in summer and winter, but there was an observatory. They were recording the wind speeds and the weather up there. But you see, they have a nice, probably a Howard clock up there on the wall. There is Mount Washington. You can drive to the top. People climb to the top, but I tell you again, it's pretty darn windy and can be quite cold up there. People die up there climbing it. But I had to sneak this picture in because my nephew's wife just came up from Austin, Texas, where they live, and one of the things she wanted to do was go to the top of Mount Washington. So there she is, probably experiencing some of that wind that I just was speaking about. Then I look for important, interesting people in these old photographs of clocks. So this is Teddy Roosevelt when he was police commissioner in New York City before he went on to become more famous as a Secretary of the Navy and our president, of course, too. I'm sure the name Wallace Nutting is familiar to most of them. There's, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of these photographic hand-colored prints that he produced that were probably in every other house in America 100 years ago. And I've collected maybe 15 or 20 that show clocks in these scenes. He sort of created these artificial colonial scenes, not always correct in a lot of ways. Because this colonial scene, in fact, shows a white dial clock. And, in the 1700s that this is depicting, the clocks were brass dial. So, he's got mix and match going on there, too. But there are some beautiful Wallace Nutting images like this. He bought early houses, fixed them up and took these pictures. And then there was kind of a production line of women who would hand paint in the colors of these Wallace Nuttings. So, of course, there's a lot of films too, and the film stills from these kinds of paintings as well. This is, of course, the famous scene here of him, and apparently he did a lot of this. Harold Lloyd did a lot of these scenes himself too. I suppose he didn't mind risking his life for art. And I don't need to tell you who these guys are, but I was happy to find this painting. This was at his at their agent's house, their producer's house, Brian Epstein, who obviously liked a nice French antique clock, which is behind these four guys as they're having fun at his house. So there's dozens of beautiful early posters, often done by very well-known, not just poster artists, but artists in general. So I have a lot of images of these. I own a couple of these big paintings that are beautiful. There another one, Omega and all too. It's obviously I'd need a much bigger house if I had a big collection of these, because these are huge. They were posters, but I just I love the graphics and the colors of these as well. And I also have a nice collection of New Yorker covers going back to the 1930s. This is just a brand new one. It just came out in May. But sometimes, again, whatever the cover artist is trying to depict, it requires the use of a clock or watch in the picture. So this is a great one, where this obviously a snooty woman is going by these vendors on New York City streets of all the counterfeits, handbags and watches. So she clearly has a real costly handbag and watch, and you see ones just like it being hawked by the street vendors in New York City. So just about done here, but I have done some exhibits of this. One was at the Willard House and Clock Museum. I hope some of you have been there. The world's largest collection of Willard clocks in the world is here on display waiting for you to visit. This is a view in one of the galleries where they took out some of the stuff and allowed me to put up my some of my horology and art imagery at that time. So that was one place where I've done exhibits. I'm a member of the Grolier Club, which is a famous long-term book collectors club. I have almost 1,000 books on horology, so I guess that entitled me to be a member of the Grolier Club. And I will do a full exhibit there in about 4 years, but they have a new members collect thing. So I brought in about 5 books and some of these prints that I've been showing you to display with the new members collection. But again, if you go to New York in about 4 years, you'll see a nice big exhibit of some of the books and some of these smaller artworks, which will be on display at the Grolier Club. And another exhibit is coming up in January. This coming January, my good friend and frequent bulletin article author, Damon DeMoro, teaches at Gordon College nearby, a Christian school. And we agreed to put together a horology and art exhibit specifically related to religion and spiritualism. So that's going to be an exciting thing. I don't think anybody's ever done an art exhibit like that before, and certainly Gordon College is the great venue for that. So I have, a fair amount of art and certainly a lot of images that we can print that just draw this unique kind of connection between religion and horology. So if any of you want to come up to the Boston area in January, I'd be happy to see you there as well. We'll probably do some events with our local chapters, special receptions and tours of that exhibit at that time. And I do, again, hope to do a nice big exhibit of this at our museum down in Columbia. We were thinking about doing it soon, but there wasn't enough gallery space. So I hope sometime within the next few years, I'll be able to put on a really nice big exhibit of horology and art, because I've got plenty, and what better place to have it than at our museum in Columbia. So I mentioned I've done a lot of these articles in the bulletin. If you go to my website and go to the art page, you'll see this list, and all of these are links. So you can click on this and read about all the things in much more detail than I've been able to discuss today. But I also had to mention that my book is now just out. I just have advanced copies from the printer of my major big book about Edward Duffield. I hope maybe you'll have me come back and speak about that. I spoke about it at the symposium last year in Lancaster. It's a big, beautiful book all about this clockmaker who was a close friend of Benjamin Franklin, their whole lives together. He produced beautiful Philadelphia clocks in the 18th century. So I hope some of you will want to buy this book, of course, and to also hear me speak about it at another time. Jerry was kind enough to mention my upcoming talk on car clocks. I've had a ball starting to put that together. My symposium at the Henry Ford Museum in 2018 was a blast. We dealt with all kinds of issues of car clocks, because they were part of the car design. If anybody was designing a car, the dashboard was important. That's what the driver saw, the whole time they were driving. It needed to be aesthetically appealing as well as functional. So the car clock, not just the mechanical aspects of it, but the design of it was very important. And I have just a great collection of eye candy images of great clocks and great dashboards, as well as, of course, the technical information about Waltham and Chelsea and New Haven and all these other companies that produced car clocks for these cars at the time. Here's, again, just an idea with the connection between racing cars and horology and watches. We all know of those connections. A lot of people who collect cars collect watches, and vice versa. They seem to be collecting features that go together. So it sort of makes sense to be talking about car clocks to a group of horology collectors as well. It just makes sense. So my final image, Edward Gorey. If any of you watch Masterpiece Theater on public TV, He did those original illustrations at the beginning of every Masterpiece episode. And here we have one of his characters looking at the sundial and saying, Bob, your time is up. You've talked long enough, and let's wrap this up. And if you have questions about this, and again, you want to know more about any of the artwork I've talked about, I'm happy to talk to you. My website, bell-time.com. Feel free to contact me. So thank you, and happy again to be invited to Atlanta. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a question via Zoom or the owl. From B. Schreiner. Are you raising your hand to ask a question?
I was just waving.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this happens a lot. You know, I just back up the dump truck and unload on everybody, and everyone sits there kind of stunned at the end. You know, it takes us a while to kind of remember where we are again. So I don't mind if it's taking you a while to think of something to ask, or if you have nothing to ask, that's fine too.
Excellent presentation. Does anyone have any questions in the audience now?
All right, I burned them out. That's good.
Oh, wait, we might have one. Here's one.
Okay.
Have you done any work on art on clocks, like reverse painting and that sort of thing?
It's really a different subject, but I have spoken twice to Lee Davis's Horological Arts chapter when they've met at the national conventions, because certainly it's art, but you know, my theme really is how artists have used timepieces in their artwork to send a message as opposed to decoration. But clearly all the art that's on clocks is to decorate the clocks. You know, they're not trying to say anything more usually than let's try to make this clock as pretty as we can so someone will buy it and enjoy it in their homes. So it's, I mean, certainly I love the way that clocks are painted, and I am happy to kind of leave that subject to Lee Davis and me sort of poke at it if he asked me to come and speak to his group. You know, the closest we get to really is, as I showed a few examples, are these reverse paintings on clock classes. You know, not all those people were amateurs or bad artists. You know, they did some good work on those clocks, but I think, you know, again, they were decorating, and there's not too many artists like Monet or Van Gogh or anything that decorated clocks. You know, they were their medium was canvas and paper, but not a clock dial or a clock glass. Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask a question. Did any of the artwork also serve as an engineering document in the beginning? Did they use those in lieu of patents to put out perhaps a schematic of what they were looking at? Did they refer back to?
Yes. When I realized my talk was too long, I cut out the whole section on horological illustration. I gave a talk on that at the symposium in 2022. And in fact, I've just been invited to the horological school in Birmingham, England, where, by the way, Rory used to teach. And that's going to be the subject there, because I have some great artworks. Yeah, I guess it would be complicated to find it now, but I'm happy to come back and do that one, because I have probably, you know, a couple of hundred going back to Leonardo da Vinci. He actually, you know, he drew a stack freed, and he drew, you know, what could be the earliest depiction of a clock escapement. And there's a lot of student work from clockmaking school, watchmaking schools. I have some great original, you know, like watercolors by watchmaking students in Eastern France, you know, and I think part of their requirements was to actually do scale drawings, large scale drawings of the watch parts and the watch movements that they were required to make. And I have a pretty good collection of patent drawings, mostly from the 1870s and 80s. With these, you know, you had to submit not just a written text of your invention to the patent office, but you had to submit detailed patent drawings. And I have some of those, to scale. And again, these were professionally done. This wasn't some guy with his ruler and a pencil. These were often professional artists that sold those services to patent applicants to show their creations in the best light. So these are illustrations that have shading, that have, color things on them too, that, as I say in that lecture about horological illustration, could be far more effective than photographs in depicting these clocks and watches. Now, when you take a picture of something, you've probably experienced yourself, you say, well, this really doesn't do this movement justice, but you get an artist there who's able to shade and emphasize, the balance wheel or, something like that. And the piece comes to life in a way that a photograph can't do. So, even to this day, the covers of sometimes of our horological magazines are artworks. They're not photographs because they can be so much more compelling. So that's a long answer to your question, but again, another time I can show you some great eye candy for those gearheads of us who want to see artists at work on gears.
Well, thank you. Anybody else have anything they want to ask? All right, Mary.
Sorry, I'm not there to have the donuts or whatever you've been pressing on.
Bob, not related to horology. Is Andover the site where one of the original satellite receiver stations was? Am I remembering that correctly?
That's ringing a bell, but I can't answer that accurately. I don't think it's something I should check for you. We are noted for some other reasons, certainly way back when they were burning witches in Salem, they were burning them in Andover too. That's not something that we're particularly proud of, but certainly these days a huge facility of the Internal Revenue Service is here. Some of you may send your taxes to my post office. So that's here. And there's also a very large Raytheon plant here that produces the Patriot missile and other things. When George H.W. Bush was president, he visited here. They had to actually build a special bathroom for him, apparently. But the Patriot missile, the Hawk missile was built here in Andover. So no doubt there's some Russian ICBMs that are targeted on Andover, Massachusetts, if they want to take out the Raytheon plant that makes all these missiles. But I guess if they take out the IRS at the same time, that's the silver lining. Who knows? But anyway, it's an interesting town. I certainly love living here. I grew up here. I live half a mile from the house I grew up in. So it's a wonderful New England town. I'm sure I can't compare to Atlanta in any way, but I'm happy here, and that's a good question. Maybe I can find out if there was something else like you talked about that's here. Also, Pfizer is here too, that produced some of the vaccines for the pandemic. So it's an interesting place to be too. Mm-hmm.
Well, right. Thank you very much for coming once again.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to check out, and I hope to see some of you in Chattanooga. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay.